The last stage into Caldwell Creek arrived on a Thursday in November of 1882, and it carried one woman, one trunk, and not a single word of explanation. Ira Hartwell had been leaning against the post outside the livery when he heard the distant rumble of the coach, the crack of the driver's whip cutting through the cold air like a rifle shot. He had not been waiting for anyone in particular. He rarely was. That was the nature of his life in Caldwell Creek, a small cattle town pressed into the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada Range in Nevada Territory, where days passed slowly, and sameness had a way of becoming comfort if a man let it. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that had known more fence wire and branding iron than any gentler thing. He owned the livery and the small pasture behind it, and he had built both himself from timber and intention. He was not unhappy. He simply was not much of anything at all, the way a field is not much before the rain comes. The stage rolled in trailing a cloud of red dust, the two lead horses blowing hard and foamy at the bit. Clyde Marsh was driving, and he looked rattled in the particular way a man looks when he has been carrying something that confused him for 40 miles. He hauled back on the lines and set the brake with a grunt, and the whole rig shuddered to a stop in the middle of Caldwell Creek's one proper street. "That it then," Clyde said loudly, though not to anyone specific. "Last run before Dunmore Pass fills with snow. After today, nothing gets through till April." People drifted out of the general store, the feed merchants, the small post office, the way they always did when the stage arrived, hoping for letters or news or something that reminded them the world beyond the mountains had not forgotten them. But what climbed down from that coach was not a letter. It was a woman. She stepped down with the careful precision of someone who had learned to manage difficult situations quietly, and she landed on the packed earth of the street with a kind of deliberate steadiness that made Ira straighten up from his post without consciously deciding to. She was perhaps 26, no older than 27, with dark red hair pinned up but coming loose at the temples from what must have been a long and demanding journey. Her traveling dress was deep green and worn, not shabby in a way that spoke of poverty, but worn in the way of someone who had been traveling a very long time. Her eyes, when she turned to survey the street, were the particular gray-blue of the sky just before a weather change, and her expression was composed in the manner of a woman who had decided, somewhere along the difficult road that had brought her here, that she was not going to show anyone how frightened she was. She had no husband beside her. She had no companion of any kind. She had one trunk, which Clyde dropped from the rear boot of the coach with considerably less ceremony than it deserved, and the trunk landed in the dirt and she did not flinch, though Ira saw her jaw tighten. Mabel Cortez, who ran the boarding house 2 doors down from the livery, was the first person in Caldwell Creek to speak to her. Mabel was a practical woman of 50 who had seen enough of the West's peculiarities to not be startled by much, and she walked over with her hands wiping on her apron and said, "You need a room." "Yes, please," the woman said. Her voice was steady and clear, a voice accustomed to being composed. "My name is Pearl Hadley. I'll need the room for at least the winter." That was all she offered, no further explanation. Nothing about where she had come from or what had driven her here, or why she had chosen a town at the edge of the mountains, with the pass closing behind her like a door being shut and locked from the outside. She simply picked up the handle at one end of her trunk and looked at Mabel and waited, and Mabel, recognizing the kind of practical stubbornness that she herself had once needed to survive, took the other handle without asking a single question, and the two of them carried Pearl Hadley's whole life up the steps and into the boarding house. Ira watched this from across the street. He went back inside the livery, took care of Clyde's horses, fed them and brushed them down, and told himself he had no particular interest in the matter. He thought about her eyes the rest of the evening. Caldwell Creek in the winter of 1882 was a settlement of roughly 240 souls pressed into a valley that the mountains made into a kind of natural fortress once the snow came. There was the boarding house, the livery, Beaumont's general store run by a red-faced man named Gerald Beaumont, who weighed things with great seriousness. A blacksmith shop belonging to a quiet man named August Reyes who had come up from Sonora 20 years prior and never left. The post office. A saloon called the Copper Rail that was neither particularly copper-colored nor near any rail. And a church that the Reverend Hollies preached in every Sunday to a congregation that ranged from devout to guilty to merely cold and needing somewhere warm to sit. There was also a doctor, a man named Philip Crane who had arrived in Caldwell Creek 3 years prior after practicing in Sacramento, and who had, by general agreement, gotten considerably better at his trade since moving somewhere quiet enough to think. He lived above his small office and was generally liked, which is a rarer thing for doctors than people think. Into this contained world, sealed by November's first snowfall 2 days after her arrival, Pearl Hadley settled herself with extraordinary quietness. She took her meals with the other boarders, which in that season meant Gerald Beaumont's unmarried brother Silas, a traveling minister who had miscalculated the season named Reverend Good, and an older woman named Mrs. Tillman who had come to visit her daughter, and then found that her daughter had moved on before she arrived, and who was therefore stranded there the same as Pearl. She spoke politely at meals, asked sensible questions about the town, volunteered nothing about herself. It was Mabel who first told Ira anything, and what she told him was not much. "Paid 3 months in advance," Mabel said on the Saturday following Pearl's arrival when Ira came in to drop off some harness work he had repaired for her. "In good coin, not a single counterfeit piece." "Good tenant, then," Ira said. "She is polite and quiet and she cries sometimes in the night, not loud. She thinks no one hears." Mabel accepted the harness and gave him the look she reserved for things that required paying attention to. "She is not a woman who has done something wrong, Ira. She is a woman that something wrong has been done to." Ira had been about to say something meaningless and agreeable, the way a man does when he wants to close a subject, but Mabel's certainty stopped him. Mabel had an instinct about human beings that Ira had learned to trust over the 11 years he had known her. "She have any friends here, anyone she came for?" "Nobody," Mabel said. "I asked as carefully as I could ask. She chose Caldwell Creek from a map. She wanted somewhere far enough that no one would think to look." She paused. "She didn't say that last part, but that is what she meant." Ira walked back across the street to the livery and stood in the doorway watching the snow come down in the gray morning light, and thought about what a person leaves behind when they board a stage to the end of the earth with everything they own in one trunk. He met Pearl properly 2 days later, not because he engineered it, but because a horse engineered it for him. One of the mares he kept in the paddock behind the livery, a young bay he called Cinnamon for no better reason than she was that color, had gotten out through a gap in the fence and found her way to the back of the boarding house, where she was, when Ira came to retrieve her, delicately eating Pearl Hadley's scarf off the windowsill. Pearl was standing at the back door in a heavy wool coat, watching the horse eat her scarf with an expression of genuine bewilderment. When Ira came around the corner, leading his apologies with him, she turned and looked at him with those gray-blue eyes, and he lost, briefly and embarrassingly, his train of thought. "That is your horse, I think," she said. "It is. I apologize sincerely. I'll mend the fence today." He took hold of Cinnamon's halter and tried to reclaim the scarf which the horse had thoroughly chewed. "I don't believe the scarf survived." Pearl looked at it for a moment. "It was not my favorite one." There was the smallest suggestion of a smile at the corner of her mouth, the kind that a person lets out before they remember they are supposed to be keeping all their warmth locked up. "I am Pearl Hadley. Ira Hartwell. I own the livery." He did not say anything else immediately because he was aware that he was about to ask her something she had been asked by every person in this town in the past week, and that she had answered 0 of those people. He chose a different path. "The mare is named Cinnamon. She is sorry about the scarf." "She does not appear sorry," Pearl said. "She has a bad face for remorse. It is a personal failing." Cinnamon chose this moment to nudge Pearl's elbow with her nose, and Pearl put her hand up instinctively and touched the horse's face, and something in her expression shifted. Not the composed mask she wore in public, but something softer and more genuine, and Ira thought he had never seen anyone look quite so homesick for something and quite so determined not to be as Pearl Hadley did in that moment. "She is lovely," Pearl said quietly. "She likes you, which means you are trustworthy. Cinnamon is an excellent judge." That small suggestion of a smile returned, and this time it made it a little further before Pearl reined it in. She looked at him for a moment in the neutral light of a cloudy November morning, the snow thin on the ground around them, the mountains rising white and severe in the near distance, and she said, "You are not going to ask me where I came from." "No, everyone else has. Everyone else is going to keep asking," he said honestly. "I figure you will tell what you want to tell when you are ready to tell it. A person is not obligated to explain their life to strangers." She looked at him for another moment, and he had the distinct feeling of being evaluated with considerable thoroughness, the way a person looks at a bridge before they decide whether it will hold. Then she said, "That is a kind thing to say. I meant it practically, not kind." "The best kind things usually are meant practically," she said, and then she went back inside and Ira led Cinnamon back to the livery and fixed the fence, and he was aware that he was not thinking about anything in particular and also was thinking, with some portion of his attention he could not fully account for, about the way Pearl Hadley's hand had touched the mare's face with that brief unguarded tenderness. The winter settled in earnest by the second week of December, and the pass was buried under 6 feet of Sierra Nevada snow that made the eastern world as remote as another continent. Caldwell Creek turned inward the way it always did, and the shortened days and long blue evenings brought its people together in the small, warm spaces that winter creates. The copper rail became less about drinking and more about company. Mabel's dining room became a kind of informal gathering place in the evenings. The church became the social center on Sunday afternoons. Pearl found a purpose for herself within 10 days of being locked in for the winter, and she did it in the direct, quiet way that Ira was beginning to understand was simply her natural mode. She walked into Dr. Crane's office one morning and told him that she had 3 years of nursing experience from a hospital in St. Louis, Missouri, and that if he could use assistance she was willing to offer it. Philip Crane, who was an excellent diagnostician but a disorganized record keeper, looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been offered a glass of water after a long, dry ride and said yes before she finished the sentence. The town noticed. In the way of small communities, they noticed everything and they formed opinions, and most of those opinions about Pearl Hadley were positive. She was competent and careful with Philip Crane. She was civil to everyone. She helped August raise his wife, Maria, when Maria's youngest came down with a fever the 3rd week of December, and she sat with the child through the night and brought the fever down, and after that, Maria spoke of Pearl with the particular warmth a mother reserves for someone who has protected her child. There were also questions. There were always questions. Silas Beaumont, who had an aggressively curious nature barely disguised under a thin coat of sociability, made several attempts to learn Pearl's history at mealtimes and was gently but completely defeated each time. He reported to his brother Gerald that Pearl Hadley was polite, intelligent, and impenetrable as a mine wall. Gerald Beaumont mentioned this to Ira one afternoon when Ira came in for flour and lamp oil. "A woman with secrets," Gerald said, in the tone of a man enjoying a story. "A woman with privacy," Ira said, which was not a correction he usually bothered to offer people, and Gerald Beaumont noticed this and stored it with the particular care people store things they find interesting. The truth of how Ira and Pearl came to spend time together was not romantic in its origin. It was practical, and the practicality of it was horses. Pearl, he discovered, had grown up around horses. Her father, whatever else he had been and wherever he was now, had kept horses on land in Missouri, and Pearl had ridden since she was a small girl. She missed it. She did not say this directly to Ira, but she began coming to the livery in the afternoons, not asking for anything, simply appearing and offering to help with what needed doing. And he let her because the help was genuine, and because Cinnamon liked her, and because the afternoons when Pearl was in the livery were considerably less quiet than the afternoons when she was not. She was good with the animals. She had a way of moving around them that was slow and deliberate without being timid, and the horses settled in her presence. She learned the names and temperaments of each one quickly, and she asked good questions about their care, and she was not afraid of the unglamorous work. "You are a good hand," he told her one afternoon in mid-December when she had helped him spend an hour cleaning stalls. "I was not raised to be decorative," she said. She was leaning on a pitchfork in a way that was entirely comfortable and unself-conscious, and there was color in her face from the cold and the work, and she looked entirely different from the composed, carefully contained woman who had stepped off the stage 3 weeks ago. "You grew up in Missouri," he said. "Not a question exactly." "Near Springfield," she said. She paused, seeming to weigh how much to give. "My father had a farm, good land, horses and cattle and grain." She stopped. He did not push. He had learned already that Pearl's silences were not invitations to fill the space but were themselves a form of information. She was deciding. He waited. "He died 4 years ago," she said. "Influenza. My mother had been gone before that." Another pause. "After he died there was a great deal of difficulty about the farm. It was sold to settle debts that I did not fully understand until after the fact." She said this with a careful flatness that told him the debts had not been legitimate ones and that she had been young and grieving and that someone had taken advantage of both those things. He kept his face neutral and let her continue if she wanted to. She did not continue, but she had given him more than she had given anyone else, and he understood this and did not press. "I grew up about 80 miles from here," he said. "Elko, Nevada. My father was a freighter. He drove goods all across the territory until the railroad changed things." He paused. "He drank. After the railroad took the work. That is not a pretty story." "Most honest ones are not pretty," Pearl said. "He died 8 years ago. I had built the livery by then and had enough to bury him decent. I think that was more than he would have done for me." He said it without anger, just the plain, factual accounting of a man who has made his peace with a hard history. "I don't say that as a sad thing. I say it as the truth." Pearl looked at him for a moment with those serious gray-blue eyes, and he had the feeling again of being evaluated carefully, and this time he did not mind it. "You are an honest person," she said. "I try to be." "I have not always been good at trusting honest people," she said. "I have mistaken honesty for simplicity and found out the hard way it is not the same thing." She picked up the pitchfork again. "I am working on it." "Seems like you are doing well enough," he said. She looked at him sideways, and this time the smile made it all the way to her eyes, and Ira Hartwell, who had lived 31 years without letting anyone do to him what the weather and the hard country could not, felt something shift in the region of his chest that he had not been prepared for. December became the heart of itself, cold and brilliant and long-nighted, and the snow on the mountains above the town turned violet in the evenings and white again in the mornings, and the pass was a wall of white silence that meant the world was only as large as Caldwell Creek and everything in it. There were things happening in the territory that touched even a small, closed-in place like Caldwell Creek. The railroads were fighting for routes through the mountains, and there were agents from competing companies who had been through the previous autumn before the pass closed, making surveys and offering money for right-of-way. There were Paiute people in the valleys to the north who had been pressed hard by the government's policies, their traditional land reduced, and their movement restricted in ways that were both cruel and practically catastrophic for people whose livelihood had always depended on following the seasons. August Reyes talked about this with a quiet anger when it came up, because August had seen what those policies had done to communities he had known, and he did not pretend it was anything other than what it was. Ira had a complicated relationship with the question because he had known Paiute men and traded with them fairly, and understood that the story the government told about those people was a lie constructed to justify what had been taken from them. And he was not a man who could make himself believe comfortable lies. But he was one man with a livery in a small town, and the machinery of what was happening to the Paiute people was enormous and moving, and he did not know what to do with his helplessness about it except to be, in every individual interaction, decent and fair and honest. Pearl, when this came up in the evenings at Mabel's table, surprised him. She had strong opinions, clearly formed from actual consideration rather than received wisdom, and she stated them directly. She had worked in the hospital in St. Louis, and she had seen what poverty and displacement did to human bodies, and she did not dress it up in polite language. Silas Beaumont was made uncomfortable by her opinions and showed it. Pearl did not accommodate his discomfort. "You are not afraid of saying unpopular things," Ira told her afterward, walking with her the short distance from the boarding house back to the livery, where he was going to check on a horse that had been off its feed. "I am afraid of a great many things," Pearl said. "Saying what I believe has not been one of them for a while now." She pulled her coat tighter against the cold. The night was very clear, the stars enormous above the open valley, the kind of sky that the mountains make that you cannot find in cities. "I was afraid of it once. I was taught that a woman's opinions are better kept to herself." She paused. "I was taught a number of things that took me considerable time to unlearn." "By your father?" "No. My father was an honest man with old-fashioned ideas, and he would argue with me and lose and respect me more for it afterward." She was quiet for a moment. "By my husband." The word landed between them and lay there in the cold air. Ira kept walking at the same pace. He did not look at her sideways, did not change his expression. "Was," he said, simply noting the tense she had used. "Yes, was." She was quiet for several steps. "He died 8 months ago." "I am sorry," Ira said. "So am I," Pearl said, and the way she said it was complicated, the way things are when grief and relief are mixed together and there is no clean word for what you feel. He did not say anything else. They reached the livery, and she stopped at the door, and he understood she was not coming in, that she had already given more than she had planned to, and needed to go back to being alone with it for a while. "Thank you for not asking questions," she said. "Thank you for telling me what you did," he said. She looked at him for a moment in the dark, the lamplight from the livery window catching the line of her jaw and the loose pieces of red hair around her face, and she said quietly, "Good night, Ira," and walked back across the snow to the boarding house. He stood in the livery doorway for a minute before going in, looking at nothing, just letting the cold air be what it was, and the sky be what it was, and the strange altered feeling in his chest be what it was. Christmas came to Caldwell Creek with snow, and the Reverend Hollis's considerably long sermon, and a dinner at the Copper Rail that was organized by Maria Reyes, and attended by nearly every soul in the valley. Because winter and proximity and the deep human need for warmth in a cold place made generosity easier than it would have been in summer. Tables were moved together and food was shared, and someone produced a fiddle, and someone else produced a guitar, and the music was not polished, but it was earnest, and it carried the particular joy of people who are genuinely glad to have each other. Pearl sat next to Maria Reyes and helped keep Maria's 3 children at the table with the patient authority of someone comfortable with children. She ate well, which Ira had noticed she sometimes did not, and she talked more than usual, and when the music started she watched it with an expression of unguarded pleasure. Ira danced twice, neither time with Pearl, because he was not yet certain enough of anything to make that kind of statement in front of the full population of Caldwell Creek. He was aware of where she was in the room with a consistency that he found both embarrassing and undeniable. It was Gerald Beaumont who said what everyone was thinking, with the subtlety of a man who had been drinking good whiskey since mid-afternoon. "Ira," Gerald said, arriving at his elbow with a glass, "you have been looking at that Hadley woman since she arrived. Why don't you just go talk to her?" "I do talk to her," Ira said. I mean in the way that is clearly your intention, Gerald said. My intention, Ira said, is to check on the Palmer's horse before midnight because he has been favoring his left front. Gerald looked at him with the expression of a man who has decided not to waste further breath on a subject. God, but you are stubborn, he said. He was. He knew he was. It was not stubbornness for its own sake, though. It was the understanding that Pearl Hadley had arrived here from something he did not yet fully know, something that had made her cry quietly in the night for the first week she was here, and that whatever she needed from this place and this winter was not necessarily a man's impatient intentions. She had given him threads of her story, and each one had the feel of something costly. He was not going to spend her trust carelessly. But he went and sat beside her when the dancing quieted down, and the evening moved into the slower warmth of people talking in small groups. And they talked for 2 hours, easy and wide-ranging, about horses and weather and books they had read, and what the territory might look like in 20 years, and whether the railroads were good for the land or terrible for it or both. She was funny, which he had known already, but in the easy late-evening way she let it out. It was a specific kind of funny, dry and quick and pointed, and it made him laugh properly in the way he did not always bother to. When people began heading home through the snow, Ira walked Pearl back to the boarding house. The night was crystalline and so cold that their breath made clouds in the air and the snow squeaked under their boots with that particular sound extreme cold makes. "This is the most I have talked in months," Pearl said. "I had forgotten I liked it. You are good at it." "I am good at very specific kinds of it," she said. "The talking that is about real things, the other kind I have always been poor at." "The small talk," he said. "The polite decoration," she said. "My husband's social world required a great deal of polite decoration. I was bad at it, and worse at pretending I was not." This was the most she had said about him since the night she had named his existence. Ira kept walking, kept his voice easy. "What was his name?" A moment. Robert Hadley." She said it without much inflection, but the way she exhaled afterward suggested the name carried weight. "He was a successful man, important in our city, well regarded." She paused. "None of those things were lies." "But," Ira said. "But a man can be successful and important and well regarded and still be a very unkind thing to live with," she said, directly and quietly. "The way you say a thing you have rehearsed alone until you can say it without your voice breaking. I do not want to give the wrong impression. He did not strike me. Some women's stories are worse than mine." She stopped walking for a moment and he stopped too, and they stood in the cold white street. "But there are other ways to diminish a person, to make them small, to make them question every instinct they have and every thought they think and every opinion they form, to make them feel foolish for wanting things." She looked up at the stars, her breath making a small cloud. "After 6 years of that, I was so small I could not recognize myself." Ira stood in the snow beside her and did not say anything for a moment, because there was nothing adequate to say in the immediate aftermath of what she had just given him. He looked at the mountains, dark and enormous against the stars, and he thought about what kind of courage it takes to board a stage to nowhere with one trunk and choose yourself over the familiar diminishment. "How did he die?" he asked, not intrusively, just the practical completion of the picture. "His heart, quickly in the night. He was 53 years old." She paused. "I did not grieve in the way people expected me to. They noticed. In St. Louis, in that social world, his people noticed that I was not the right kind of widow. There were questions about the will, about the house, his brother." She stopped. "I took what was mine and what could not be argued about, and I found a map and I got on a stage." "And the past closed behind you," Ira said. She looked at him with an expression he could not fully read in the dark, something layered and searching. "Yes," she said, "and the past closed behind me." They stood there for another moment in the cold and the stillness, and then she said good night and went inside, and Ira walked back across the street and sat in the dark of the livery for a long time, not thinking anything in particular, just feeling the shape of what she had told him. January arrived with a blizzard that lasted 4 days and covered the lower roofs of Caldwell Creek to the windowsills and made going outdoors a serious negotiation with the elements. Philip Crane came down with a respiratory complaint on the second day of the blizzard, and Pearl took over his practice with the calm efficiency of someone who had done more with less. She had good hands and a good mind, and Philip told her, when the blizzard broke and his lungs cleared, that she was a better nurse than he deserved, and that if she ever wanted to be a doctor, he would teach her everything he knew. Pearl told Ira this one afternoon in the livery, and the pride in her face was something she was not quite containing, and it was one of the best things he had ever seen in his life. "You should let him," Ira said. "Teach me. You would be the only woman doctor in 500 miles, probably. That is not a comfortable thing to be. Comfortable and meaningful are not always the same county," he said. She looked at him across Cinnamon's broad back where she was brushing the horse with long, steady strokes. "When did you become a philosopher?" "I have always been one," he said. "Very practical philosophy, though. It barely counts." She smiled at him fully, no reservation, no containment, and it was such a complete and uncomplicated thing that it stopped him for a moment the way unexpected beauty sometimes stops people mid-stride. He had started to understand, in the way of January with its long cold evenings and shortened days, and the two of them thrown constantly into each other's company by the simple geometry of a small town in winter, that what he felt for Pearl Hadley was not a passing warmth generated by proximity and scarcity of company. It was specific. It was specifically her mind, which moved fast and honestly and did not spare comfortable assumptions. It was specifically her laugh, which she produced less often than it deserved but which was genuine and full when it came. It was her hands on the horses, her steadiness with Philip Crane's patience, the way she had walked off that stage with nothing explained and everything in one trunk, and made herself useful and present and real in this place within a week. He was not a man who had been in love before. He had been fond of women. He had been, briefly, involved with a woman in Elko who had eventually married a rancher and moved to Oregon, and he had wished her well with no particular pain. What he felt for Pearl was a different order of thing entirely. It had gravity to it. He did not say any of this to her. Not yet. It was too soon for what she had been through, and he would not be Robert Hadley, who had presumably pursued her with whatever counted as his version of charm and had her committed to his life before she fully understood what it was. He would wait. He would be her friend, which was the most honest thing he could be right now, and he would let her find out who she was in this place, this new life she had chosen, and he would not crowd it. But January was long and cold, and the evenings at Mabel's table were warm and good, and Pearl across from him, laughing at something Reverend Good said, or arguing gently with Mrs. Tillman about the best way to treat a fever was a consistent and daily pleasure that made the winter feel like something other than endurance. One evening in the third week of January, a man named Cal Deaver arrived in Caldwell Creek in a way that was unusual, which was to say, on horseback from the western side of the valley rather than through the pass. Cal Deaver was a cattleman who had a ranch 10 miles north of town and who had, it turned out, been in Caldwell Creek when the pass closed and had simply stayed rather than go home, because Cal Deaver was the kind of man who found reasons to stay wherever there was warm company and easy whiskey. He was 45, heavy-jawed, and had the particular confidence of a man who owned a great deal of land and had gotten accustomed to people deferring to him because of it. He noticed Pearl at the first communal dinner after his arrival, which was a Thursday gathering at the Copper Rail that happened most weeks as an informal community event. He noticed her with the kind of attention that was appreciative but not careful, the attention of a man who did not think particularly hard about whether his attention was wanted. Ira watched this from across the room and felt something cool and purposeful settle in him. Not jealousy exactly, or not only that. Protectiveness that had been given a specific direction. Cal Deaver introduced himself to Pearl with a broad, self-assured manner, and the assumption that she would find him interesting because most people in his experience did, because he was rich and loud and took up a great deal of space, which some people mistake for substance. Pearl was polite. She was polite to everyone. It was her nature. But she was also, Ira noticed, the specific kind of polite that was also a wall. And when Cal made the particular inquiry about where she had come from that everyone else had also made, and that everyone else had been deflected from, Pearl deflected him with the same smooth finality she deflected everyone. And then she excused herself to help Maria Reyes settle the children. Cal Deaver watched her go and then looked around and found Ira's eyes and said, loudly enough to carry, "Well, that is a fine-looking woman with a hell of a good wall around her. I like a challenge." Ira looked at him for a moment and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. In the following days, Cal Deaver made what he considered a campaign, which involved appearing wherever Pearl was likely to be and offering things, which was his standard approach. He offered to procure better firewood for Mabel's house, which was not needed because Mabel had plenty of firewood. He offered to buy Pearl a horse, which she did not want to receive from him and said so plainly. He offered his opinion on her work with Philip Crane, which was uninformed and unsolicited. Pearl managed him with steady patience and no encouragement, and Ira watched and stayed out of it because she was not asking for his intervention and did not need it. But one afternoon when Ira was in the general store and Cal Deaver was there, Cal made a comment to Gerald Beaumont about Pearl in the particular way men sometimes speak about women when they are in each other's company, and think it is safe. The kind of comment that reduced her to the sum of her appearance and her inaccessibility as a personal affront to Cal's sense of the order of things. It was not a cruel comment, but it was a reductive one. The kind that makes a woman a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known. Ira put down the lamp oil he was holding and looked at Cal Deaver and said, quietly and completely without theater, "I would not say that kind of thing about her again." Cal looked at him with the surprise of a man not accustomed to being corrected. "I meant nothing by it." "I know you meant nothing by it," Ira said. "That is sort of the point." He paid for the lamp oil and left, and Cal Deaver looked after him with the expression of a man who has just recalibrated something. Gerald Beaumont told Mabel, and Mabel told August Reyes, and August Reyes mentioned it to Maria, and within 48 hours it had made its way to Pearl, because that is how small towns work in winter when there is nothing else to process. Pearl did not say anything about it directly to Ira. But the next afternoon when she came to the livery, she brought him a piece of cornbread she had made at Mabel's and set it on the bench beside where he was working on a bridle and said, "Mabel makes good cornbread." And he said, "She does." And they both understood what had been communicated and did not require anything further. Cal Deaver, for his part, eased off his campaign after that, not dramatically but perceptibly, and the winter community of Caldwell Creek returned to its normal equilibrium. Cal was not a bad man, Ira thought, just a man who needed correcting sometimes, and he had taken it well enough. February arrived, and with it a cold so deep it made the previous week seem temperate by comparison. The mountains above Caldwell Creek held all their snow and more came. The springs froze and had to be broken open each morning. 3 of Philip Crane's patients had frostbite of varying severity, and Pearl's work in the office became nearly constant. She was tired. Ira could see it in her face in the evenings, the way she held herself more carefully when she was very tired, more rigidly upright as if posture could substitute for reserve. He started leaving hot coffee on the bench in the livery at the time she usually came, because she came to the livery in those cold weeks more out of genuine need for something simple and good than for the work itself. The horses were comfort to her, the uncomplicated warmth of large animals in a heated barn, the smell of hay and clean leather. One evening in mid-February she fell asleep sitting on a hay bale leaning against Cinnamon's stall, which was not where a person should sleep, but which also, Ira thought, looking at her from the doorway, was exactly where she needed to be. The mayor was standing calmly beside her, not moving. Ira got a blanket from the tack room and put it over her shoulders without waking her, and then went to the other end of the livery to do work that needed doing. And he sat up until nearly midnight when she woke, startled and confused, and he said, "You fell asleep. I did not want to disturb you." Pearl looked at him for a moment with the confused, unguarded face of someone freshly awake, and then understanding settled in and she put a hand to her hair, which had come half down. "You stayed up." "I had work," he said. She looked at him with the particular direct look she had that always made him feel she was seeing things he had not put into words. "Ira," she said. "Yes." "Why are you so careful with me?" He thought about this honestly. "Because you deserve to be treated carefully," he said. "And I think you have not always been." She was quiet for a long time. The horse shifted and the lamplight moved. Outside, the wind was doing what February wind does in the mountains, which is everything. "I think about my life here," she said slowly. "The life I am making. It is mine in a way that no part of my last life was." She paused. "I am afraid of wanting things. Wanting things led me into bad decisions before." "Pearl," he said. "Yes. I am not going to tell you what to want," he said. "And I am not going to stop being your friend because I want things that you may not want. Whatever you need this winter to be, it will be that." She looked at him in the dim lamplight, the blanket still around her shoulders, her hair down and the cold in her cheeks, and she looked very much like a person who was deciding something important. "What if I wanted something too?" she said, carefully, like someone walking onto uncertain ice. "What would that look like?" He stood up from the bench where he had been sitting and crossed the livery, and he stood in front of her and he said, "I think it would look like telling me." She held his gaze for a moment and then she said, very quietly, "I think I would like you to stop being careful with me." He reached out and took her hand, which was warm from the blanket and smaller than he expected, and she looked at his hand holding hers with the same focused attention she gave everything. And he thought he had never done anything so consequential in his life as hold this woman's hand in a livery in the middle of a February night in the mountains. "All right," he said. She stood up from the hay bale and they were close together in the warm lamplight barn, and she looked up at him, and he kissed her softly, the way you do a thing you have been thinking about carefully for a long time, and she kissed him back without hesitation, which was its own kind of answer to every question he had been too cautious to ask. They stood together for a while in the warm barn with the wind outside and the horses quiet, and the mountains pressing their enormous white weight against all sides of the valley. And when they finally separated, she put her forehead against his shoulder for a moment, and he put his arm around her, and neither of them said anything at all, which was the right thing. March came in and the snow was still deep in the pass, but there was a quality to the light that changed, a longer day and a slightly gentler angle to the sun, and the town of Caldwell Creek began to stir with the particular anticipatory restlessness of a community that has been sealed inside a snow globe for 4 months and can see the edges of spring beginning. Ira and Pearl were not secret in Caldwell Creek. Small towns do not permit secrets, and neither of them was interested in pretense. They were, by the general assessment of the community, clearly suited to each other in the specific way that makes even people with no personal investment in a romance feel that something has been correctly arranged. Mabel said, to anyone who asked and some who did not, that she had known it from the morning Pearl stepped off the stage, because a woman who cries quietly in the night is a woman whose heart has not stopped working. It has simply been waiting. Maria Reyes told August that Ira was a different man, lighter, which August denied for 20 minutes before admitting was accurate. Philip Crane told Pearl that he hoped she was staying in Caldwell Creek permanently because he had no intention of going back to managing his records alone, and then he cleared his throat and added that he was personally glad she seemed happy, which was about as demonstrative as Philip Crane got, and Pearl hugged him, which startled him considerably. The evenings changed in quality. They walked in the cold together after dinner and talked for hours. the deep-ranging talks of two people who are genuinely interested in each other's minds, who find that each conversation opens three more things to discuss, who are learning each other with the particular attention of people who understand that this kind of knowing is not something you rush. He told her about his father in more detail than he had told anyone, about the years of watching a man diminish himself, and taking the freight work at 15 to provide for both of them and feeling simultaneously resentful and sorry, and how those feelings had finally untangled themselves into something he could live with but had taken a long time to do it. She told him about Robert in more detail too, not all at once but in pieces, the way you clear a difficult space gradually. About the early years when she had thought his controlling nature was protection and love, and the slow accumulation of years in which she came to understand it was neither. About the way he had isolated her from her friends, subtly and always with reasons that sounded reasonable. About the loneliness of being in a house full of people at his social events and having no one to be honest with. About the day she had realized, sitting in the kitchen of their large, well-appointed house in St. Louis, that she had not had a single thought she would be willing to speak aloud in 6 months, and that this was a kind of emergency. "I started planning after that," she said. They were sitting in the livery on a night in late March, the temperature climbing enough that the stove was only necessary rather than desperate, and she was on the bench beside him with her shoulder against his. "I saved money he did not know about. I made quiet arrangements. And then he died, which changed everything and also, in some ways, nothing, because his brother was very much like him and was immediately prepared to continue the project of telling me what my life should contain." "His brother," Ira said, "Edward Hadley." Something in her voice went careful. "He contested the will. He said Robert had promised him certain things that were not in the written document. The house, primarily. I let him have the house. I did not want it. I took what was clearly mine and what could be liquidated quickly and quietly, and then I found a map." She paused. "He is the reason no one knows where I am." Ira sat with this for a moment. "Do you think he would come after you?" "I think he spent a great deal of money contesting the will and got a house that I had removed most of the worthwhile contents from, and I think his pride was damaged considerably, and I think a man like that does not forget." She said it calmly, the calm of someone who has already accounted for a risk and decided to live with it. "But the pass is closed until April. And I am a different name in a different place, and I told no one where I was going. Pearl Hadley is your real name." "My real name." She said this with a small amount of emphasis on the word real. "I was born Pearl Margaret Cassidy. I became Hadley when I married. I see no reason to lose my own name simply because I am also a widow." "No," he agreed. "There is no reason for that." She looked at him. "I should have told you this sooner." "You told me when you were ready to tell me," he said. "That is the only timeline that matters." She put her hand over his and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and the horses moved softly in their stalls, and the wind came down off the mountains with the first suggestion of warmth in it. April arrived, and with it the beginning of the pass opening. It came gradually, the snow settling and crusting, and the first hints of bare rock showing on the lower slopes, and then the upper road becoming navigable in the way of early spring passes, treacherous and slow, but passable for someone who knew what they were doing. The first rider came through from the eastern side on the 5th of April, a male courier named Henry who was paid exceptionally well for doing extremely inadvisable things, and he brought letters and newspapers that were 4 months old and read like dispatches from a distant country. He also brought, among the mail he carried, a letter addressed to Pearl Hadley at Caldwell Creek, Nevada Territory. It was from Edward Hadley. Ira was not with her when she opened it. He found her afterward in the livery, standing with the letter in her hand and her jaw tight, and the specific rigid posture she used when she was managing a difficult thing. "He knows where I am," she said. He came to her and took the letter she extended and read it. It was 4 paragraphs of legal language and personal threat elegantly blended, the kind of letter written by a man who has access to lawyers, and is comfortable with intimidation. Edward Hadley had, the letter said, evidence that Pearl had removed property from the estate that was rightfully contested, and he intended to recover it through whatever means were necessary, and he would be coming to Caldwell Creek in the spring. Ira read it twice. Then he folded it and handed it back to her. "He sent this in November," he said. "He's been waiting for the pass to open too." "Yes." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not entirely. "I don't know how he found out where I went. I told no one." "The stage company," Ira said. "They keep manifests. A man with money and lawyers can find most things." She pressed her lips together. "The things I took are mine. They were my mother's jewelry and a small amount of money my father had given me that I had kept separate during the entire marriage. He has no legal claim." She paused. "But he has money and I have very little, and he understands that." Ira sat down on the bench and thought carefully. "Philip Crane is friends with a lawyer in Carson City. A good one, Philip says. We can get a letter to him before Edward Hadley arrives." She looked at him. "We?" "Yes," he said simply. She held his gaze, and something moved in her expression, something that was not quite tears but was their near neighbor. "You do not have to do this. Pearl," he looked up at her. "When you decided you were done being small, you got on a stage. You did not ask anyone's permission. You did not require anyone's help." He stood up. "But you have help now if you want it. That is different from requiring it." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she crossed the livery and he stood up, and she took his face in her hands and kissed him with the full, unguarded feeling she had been careful with until now. Not soft and tentative, but deliberate and warm and real. And he put his arms around her and held on with the feeling of a man who has found something he did not know he had been looking for. "I want it," she said, against his mouth. "Good," he said. They wrote to Philip's lawyer friend in Carson City. His name was Warren Alcott, and Philip vouched for him strongly enough that Ira trusted it. Pearl wrote a careful and thorough account of the items she had taken, with documentation of their provenance as her mother's property and the money as a premarital gift, and Ira added a letter of his own, as a member of the community attesting to her character and circumstances, which he was told by Philip was not a standard legal document, but was also the kind of thing that could matter to a judge who was a human being. The reply came in 3 weeks. Warren Alcott's assessment was clear. Edward Hadley had a weak case. The items were provably Pearl's by origin. The money was not part of the marital estate if it had never been commingled. Edward Hadley's primary leverage was his money and his willingness to spend it on making Pearl's defense expensive enough to be exhausting. Alcott offered to handle it, for a fee that was fair, and to have a letter waiting for Edward Hadley when he arrived in Caldwell Creek making this position clear. Pearl read this letter and set it down and put her hands flat on the table in Philip Crane's office and breathed for a moment. "All right," she said. "All right," Philip agreed. The spring opened the valley, and with it came the sounds and smells of a world thawing back into itself. The mud season, which in the mountains is its own kind of difficult, was followed by the first green on the lower slopes, and then the wildflowers in the valley floor that the snow had been holding in suspension all winter, suddenly and abundantly there. Caldwell Creek, after a hard winter, had the particular energy of a community that has survived something together and is glad to have done it. Mrs. Tillman had her daughter located, who had moved to a town 60 miles west, and was reunited with her in a tearful scene at the stage depot that most of the town witnessed unashamedly. Reverend Good went on his way with a better understanding of mountain meteorology. Silas Beaumont returned to his normal life of selling things. Mabel's boarding house felt less crowded, which meant Pearl had a room largely to herself, and Pearl had by this time been offered, by Philip Crane, a formal position as his medical assistant at an actual salary. She accepted with the composed dignity she brought to most good things, and then went to the livery and told Ira, and the smile that broke over her face when she did it was the fullest, freest expression he had seen from her, pure, uncomplicated joy. He put down what he was doing and crossed the livery and picked her up and turned with her, which she did not expect and which surprised a laugh out of her that rang in the warm air of the barn and made every horse in the place lift their head. "Ira," she said, still laughing, her hands on his shoulders. "Congratulations," he said, setting her down. "Dr. Crane has excellent taste." "I am not a doctor," she said. "I am a very good nurse." "For now," he said. She looked at him with the directness that was entirely her own. "He did say he would teach me. I know what he said." Something in her face went thoughtful and deep and searching, the way it did when she was thinking about something significant. "I came here to stop disappearing," she said. "I think I may be doing the opposite." "You are," he said. "You are becoming someone." "I was always someone," she said with a small, precise firmness. "You know what I mean." "I do." She reached up and touched his face, a gesture she had begun to do sometimes that always stopped him completely, the simple, direct warmth of it. "I know what you mean." Edward Hadley arrived in Caldwell Creek on a Wednesday in late May, which was his misfortune because a Wednesday was the day Warren Alcott happened to be in town, having come himself rather than sent only letters, because Alcott was that kind of lawyer who preferred to be present when things resolved. Edward Hadley was a man in his mid-40s with Robert Hadley's jaw and none of his social polish, a man who wore his wealth as a weapon and whose face arranged itself naturally into expressions of displeasure. He arrived by stage with a hired man whose function was presumably intimidation, and he came first to the boarding house looking for Pearl, and Mabel told him Pearl was not available and that he might wish to speak with Mr. Warren Alcott, who was at the general store. The meeting between Edward Hadley and Warren Alcott was brief and reportedly not pleasant for Hadley, who had anticipated a frightened widow in a remote town and found instead a frontier lawyer who had done his preparation thoroughly and was unimpressed by wealth applied as pressure. The legal position was set out plainly. The items Pearl had taken were hers by provenance. The money was hers by documentation. Any action Hadley pursued would be defended fully, and the documentation would be provided to any court he chose to bring it to. Alcott additionally noted, with a particular kind of gentleness that was also a warning, that the town of Caldwell Creek was acquainted with Pearl Hadley, and that any conduct toward her that moved from legal to personal would be observed by a community that was protective of its own. Ira was not at this meeting. He was at the livery, doing what he did every day, and Pearl was at Philip Crane's office doing the same. They had agreed that she did not need to be in the room for it, and she had agreed without argument, which told him something about how far she had come from the woman who had been taught to second-guess every instinct she had. Edward Hadley left Caldwell Creek the same day. He did not speak to Pearl. Pearl heard about his departure from Mabel, who heard it from Gerald Beaumont, who had watched the stage pull away. She was quiet for a while after hearing it, standing in Philip Crane's office in the afternoon light with her hands folded in front of her, and then she said to Philip, "I would like to take the afternoon." She came to the livery and found Ira and told him, and he watched her face while she absorbed it, the slow unwinding of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, and he thought that watching a person become free was one of the most significant things he had ever seen. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he agreed. She put her hands over her face for a moment, and he thought she was going to cry, but when she lowered them her eyes were dry and her face was clear and she said, "I would like to ride." He saddled Cinnamon for her because the mare loved her, and he saddled his own horse, a steady gray gelding named Bishop, and they rode out of Caldwell Creek into the valley floor where the wildflowers were in full extravagant bloom, the mountains enormous on all sides and the sky deeply, immodestly blue, and they rode for 2 hours without speaking much, just the wind and the horses and the smell of sage and the feeling of open country after a long winter. When they stopped on a rise above the valley and looked back at the small cluster of buildings that was Caldwell Creek, Pearl said, "I love it here." "Good," he said. "I was not sure I would ever love a place again," she said. "The way you love a place you know is yours." He looked at her in profile against the enormous sky, this woman who had stepped off a stage with one trunk and no explanation and had, over the winter, become the most important person in his daily existence without his having planned for it. "Pearl," he said. She turned to look at him. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want to say before I ask it that whatever you answer, I will be glad you came here and I will be your friend for as long as you will have me." She held his gaze very steadily. "Ask it. Will you marry me?" he said. Not elaborately, not performed. Just the plain, honest offer of a man who meant it entirely. She looked at him for a long moment and he waited without anxiety, because whatever she said he would accept and because he had learned this winter that waiting for Pearl Hadley was never wasted time. "Yes," she said, "I will, but I want to say something first." "Say it." "I am not marrying you because I need to be married," she said. "I am not marrying you because the past was closed and you were kind to me and the options were limited. I am marrying you because you are the most honest person I have met in my adult life, and because you made me laugh in February in a blizzard, and because when I am with you I am entirely myself, and I did not know that feeling was available to me." She paused. "I want that to be clearly stated." "It is stated," he said, "clearly." She looked at him with those gray-blue eyes in the open mountain air, and she smiled with her whole face, and he thought that smile was the best thing he had ever seen in 31 years of seeing things, and he leaned across the space between their horses and kissed her while Bishop and Cinnamon stood together patiently in the wildflowers. They were married in June in Reverend Hollis's church, which had never been so full. The entire 240 residents of Caldwell Creek appeared to be in attendance, which in practical terms meant that approximately 40 people were outside looking through the windows. Mabel sat in the front row and cried openly and without embarrassment. Maria Reyes had made Pearl a dress from fabric she had been saving, cream-colored linen with small embroidered details at the cuffs and collar, and Pearl wore her hair half down with white wildflowers in it, and she walked up the aisle of that small wooden church in the Nevada mountains looking like someone who had finally arrived somewhere after a very long journey. Ira stood at the front of the church in his good coat and his cleanest boots, and when he saw her come through the door, he stopped breathing momentarily in the particular way that beauty insists on, the involuntary complete attention, and he thought, in the most straightforward terms, that nothing in his life had prepared him for how much he loved her. The vows, they said, were the traditional ones, but Pearl added something at the end that she had asked Reverend Hollis if she could add, and he had said yes because he was a man who understood that women sometimes needed to say things officially. She said, "And I come to this with everything I am and nothing I am not." It was simple and it was entirely Pearl, and when she said it, Mabel cried harder and August Reyes cleared his throat in the way of a man who is feeling something he did not plan to feel, and Ira took Pearl's hands and thought that he was the luckiest man in Nevada territory and possibly in the entire American West. Philip Crane threw rice. He did it with scientific precision, and it hit Ira directly in the eye. The summer that followed was the best of Ira's life, which is a thing he would have said with such simple certainty that it would have left no room for argument. Pearl moved into the house behind the livery, which was small and which she approached with the particular practical creativity she brought to everything, moving things and adding things and making it theirs rather than his without erasing what it had been, which is an art that not everyone has. She continued her work with Philip Crane. She was, by the assessment of everyone who encountered her professionally, exceptional at it, and Philip had begun, in the careful, methodical way of a good teacher, actually teaching her. He gave her his medical texts, and she read them at night beside the lamp, and asked him questions the next morning that often made him go back to his own reference books. She had a genuine talent for diagnosis, the kind that is partly learned and partly the intuitive reading of a patient's body and manner that cannot entirely be taught. Ira watched her become herself in this place, and he thought of what Mabel had said on the day Pearl arrived, that she was a woman that something wrong had been done to. He thought about the courage of choosing your own rescue, of boarding a stage to the end of the world with one trunk, and the will to become someone no one had diminished yet. The livery prospered in the summer months, which were the busy season, when cattle operations across the valley needed horses serviced, and when travelers moving through the mountains needed animals rested and reshod. Ira hired a young man named Danny Fowler, 17 years old, son of a struggling homesteader north of town, who was good with horses and eager to learn, and Ira taught him with the patience that he himself had wished for at that age, which made Danny loyal in a way that a teenager rarely is to an employer. The late summer brought a development that was not entirely unexpected. Pearl came to find Ira in the paddock on a warm August morning and told him, in the direct way she told him everything, that Philip Crane believed she was expecting a baby. Ira looked at her for a moment, and then he crossed the paddock and took her face in his hands and said, "Are you well? Are you all right?" She put her hands over his. "I am very well," she said. "I am also, if you need to know, very pleased." He pulled her close and held her, and she let him, leaning into his chest with the trusting ease that she had built over months of being with a person who kept his word. And above them the Nevada sky was the deep saturated blue of high summer, and the mountains were green to their midslopes, and the world felt enormous and benevolent and exactly right. "A baby," he said, into her hair. "In February, Philip thinks," she said. Which means it was conceived approximately in the spot where this whole ridiculous, wonderful thing started. "The livery," he said. "I was not going to say that specifically," she said, "but yes." He laughed, genuinely and fully, in the way she had always been able to bring out of him, and she laughed with him, standing in the August paddock with the horses moving around them. The autumn of 1883 came in golden and generous, the aspens turning yellow in their groves up the slopes of the mountains, and Pearl's pregnancy was steady and healthy, the kind that Philip described as textbook, which was both reassuring and a little anticlimactic for a man who liked to apply his skills to something. Pearl herself said she felt better than she had in years, which was true and also not surprising, because a body held in tension for 6 years and then finally allowed to relax has a great deal of ease to catch up on. She kept working through October and into November, which caused some comment from those who had traditional ideas about what pregnant women should and should not do. She was politely immovable on this subject. She worked until December, when the pass began to close again, and Caldwell Creek settled in for its second winter with Pearl in it. This time, a very different kind of winter, warm with anticipation and the ongoing industry of the house that was now full of life. Mabel came and helped prepare the second bedroom, which was going to be the baby's room, and Maria Reyes brought fabric for curtains, and August built a cradle in his blacksmith shop from the best timber he could find, which was not technically blacksmithing, but which he did with the same precise attention. Philip Crane organized his medical supplies with the seriousness of a man preparing for the most important examination of his career. In the evenings of that second winter, Ira and Pearl sat beside the stove with her feet on his lap, and the lamplight making everything amber and warm, and they talked, endlessly and pleasurably, about everything and about nothing. She read to him from her medical texts, and he argued with the diagnoses until she pointed out that he was wrong, which was regularly. He told her things about horses that she found genuinely interesting because she was genuinely interested in things. They made each other laugh. They argued, sometimes seriously, about questions that mattered, and the arguments were the kind that end in greater understanding rather than casualties, and neither of them considered this ordinary, because neither of them had always had it. "I sometimes think about the woman who got off that stage," Pearl said one evening in January, watching the fire in the stove through its small glass window. "What do you think about her?" Ira said. "That she was brave and had no idea she was brave," Pearl said. "She thought she was just desperate." She paused. "I was so frightened. I had no plan beyond getting far enough away. I chose this place because it was at the edge of something at the foot of those mountains, and it felt like once I was there nothing could follow me over. She was quiet for a moment, and the pass closed. Like a door, he said. Like a door, she agreed. And everything that was on the other side of it stayed there. She looked at him, and what was on this side turned out to be very good. He looked at her in the lamplight, this woman with the dark red hair and the gray-blue eyes, and the mind that moved faster than he could always follow, and the heart that had been locked up and had been opening, incrementally and deliberately, since the day she arrived. She was large with their child, and she was tired in the evenings, and she was more herself than anyone he had ever known, stubbornly and beautifully and entirely herself. "I love you," he said, which was a thing he said to her, and which had not diminished in weight a single time in the month since he had first said it, because he meant it precisely each time. "I know you do," she said, which was not a deflection but a statement of trust, the most specific version of "I love you too" in her particular language, the assurance that she believed it. "I love you, Ira." The baby came on a Tuesday in February of 1884, which was a full year after the night in the livery when Pearl had asked him to stop being careful with her. And Philip Crane was there with Pearl and Mabel and Maria, and Ira spent 2 hours outside in the cold with August Reyes, who had done this 3 times himself and was very calm about it, which helped. The baby was a boy. He was a large, healthy, loud boy who arrived in the world with the full intention of announcing himself. And when Philip brought him out and placed him in Ira's arms, Ira stood in the doorway of his own house and held his son and felt something move through him that had no adequate name, something enormous and quiet at the same time. Pearl was tired and bright-eyed, and when Ira came to her she reached for the baby and he settled into the cradle of her arms with the absolute certainty of something arriving where it belongs. "What do we name him?" Pearl asked. They had discussed names through the winter with the pleasant arguing of 2 people who have opinions. They had a short list. But looking at him now, at the particular weight and reality of him, Ira said the name that felt right. "James," he said. "James Cassidy Hartwell." Pearl looked up at him. He had used her birth name, her father's name, her own original name before marriage had changed it, and she understood what he was doing, which was giving her father a place in this continuation of things, and giving Pearl herself a thread that connected this new life to the person she had always been before anyone tried to diminish her. Her eyes filled. "Yes," she said simply and fully. "Yes, that is right." Caldwell Creek received James Cassidy Hartwell with the enthusiasm of a small community that had been watching his parents fall in love all winter, and was pleased to see things proceeding correctly. Mabel was, by informal community consensus, considered his honorary grandmother, a role she accepted with tremendous seriousness and zero objection. Maria Reyes's children appointed themselves his older siblings in the way children do when they decide something should be so. August Reyes declared him a fine-looking boy and carved his name into the cradle he had built. Danny Fowler, who had been working the livery through the winter, came to the house on the day Pearl brought the baby home and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said that he hoped everything was well. And Pearl told him to come in and sit down, and he sat at their kitchen table and held James for about 30 seconds with the extreme caution of a young man holding a baby for the first time, and then handed him back with clear relief and told Pearl she and Ira were very lucky, and meant it without any of the usual awkwardness of a 17-year-old attempting a sentimental observation. Spring came again and the pass opened again, and the second year of Pearl's life in Caldwell Creek moved forward in the way a good life does, with work and difficulty and small pleasures, and the particular deepening satisfaction of a life that is genuinely yours. Pearl had by this time progressed in her medical education to the point where Philip Crane declared, formally, and in front of a dinner party at Mabel's, that she was the most capable person he had trained, and that he was writing to a colleague in San Francisco who was involved in the early movements for women's medical education, to tell him about her. Pearl received this with a composed dignity that meant she was very moved and did not want to be obvious about it. Ira squeezed her hand under the table and she let him. There was news from the wider territory that year, news about the railroad routes being finally settled, and about the government's ongoing and deeply unjust treatment of indigenous peoples across the West. And Pearl and Ira and August and Maria had long conversations about it at their table, conversations that did not always resolve into optimism but that were honest, which mattered. The world was large and complicated and had more wrong in it than they could correct, and they held that knowledge without pretending otherwise, while also making their own small corner of it as decent as they could manage. In the autumn of that year, a young woman arrived in Caldwell Creek on the stage, not the last stage before the pass closed, but an ordinary stage in early October, and she was alone and looked very tired, and Pearl was the first person to go to her. Pearl brought her to Philip's office, saw that she was fed and warm, and asked her nothing that was not immediately necessary. She arranged a room at Mabel's for her. She sat with her that first evening and was simply present, and the young woman, whose name was Agnes Carroll and who had, it turned out, a not entirely dissimilar story to Pearl's own, felt something ease in her chest in the particular way that happens when a person meets someone who genuinely understands without needing to be explained to. Ira watched Pearl with Agnes Carroll and felt, along with pride, a clear and settled recognition of what Pearl Hadley Hartwell was in this place. She had arrived here with nothing explained and everything in one trunk, and she had become, quietly and entirely on her own terms, someone this community relied on, turned to, trusted. She was Philip Crane's partner in medicine. She was the person that frightened or lost women sought out when they needed someone who would not judge them. She was Mabel's closest friend and Maria Reyes's, and the person Danny Fowler's mother sent him to when she had a question about her youngest son's persistent cough. She was also, every day, Ira's wife, which was a thing he did not take for granted because he understood it was not inevitable and was not owed to him, and was the most specific and ongoing gift of his life. The winters continued to be long and the summers short, and the mountains permanently enormous and beautiful above the valley, and time moved in the way it does when a life is being genuinely lived. James Hartwell grew from a loud, healthy baby into a loud, healthy toddler who had his mother's gray eyes, and his father's hands and everyone's opinion about whether this meant he would be a doctor or a horseman or both, or something else entirely. When James was 2 years old, Pearl came to Ira one evening in the livery, which was where she still came when she had something important to tell him, because the livery was where the important things between them had always been said, and she told him there would be another baby. This one came in the spring, which gave her the best part of the pregnancy in good weather, and she worked through most of it with Philip's careful monitoring and arrived at her delivery in excellent health. She had a daughter this time, a small, fierce-looking girl who regarded the world from the first moments, with an expression of serious evaluation that Pearl recognized immediately as her own. They named her Clara, after Pearl's mother, and Clara Hartwell arrived in the world in April of 1886, with the spring wildflowers already starting in the valley, and the mountains shedding their snow in long silver sheets. And Caldwell Creek received her with the same warm communal enthusiasm it had given James, because this was a town that understood what it had in the Hartwells and was glad of it. Mabel held Clara the afternoon of her birth and looked at Pearl over the baby's head with the expression of a woman who has seen a story arrive at its right ending. And Pearl, tired and happy and fully present in her own life, smiled at Mabel with the complete and uncomplicated warmth of a person who knows that they are where they belong. Ira sat beside Pearl that evening with James asleep in the next room and Clara in Pearl's arms, and the lamp burning low, and the mountains outside the window holding the last light of a long spring day, And he thought about the woman who had stepped off the last stage before the pass closed with nothing explained and everything she owned in one trunk. And he thought about the way she had touched Cinnamon's face that first morning with that brief, unguarded tenderness. And he thought about all the distance between that November morning and this April evening, all the winter and the spring and the year and the years. "Tell me what you are thinking," Pearl said, watching his face. "I am thinking about the first morning I saw you," he said. "You were standing at the back door of the boarding house and Cinnamon had eaten your scarf." "My second least favorite scarf," she said. "You said it was not your favorite one." "I lied slightly. It was my second least favorite." "You lied to protect my feelings about my horse." "She had a very apologetic face," Pearl said, "even though she did not." He laughed quietly, careful of the sleeping baby. "I looked at you in that cold gray morning and I thought that you looked like a person who had made a decision and was going to hold to it no matter what." "I was going to," she said. "I know you were." He took her free hand and held it. "I want you to know that I have never once regretted anything about this. Not one morning since you came, not one day." Pearl looked at him with those gray-blue eyes, serious and direct and warm, the eyes he had loved since the first day he saw them, the eyes he would know from across any distance, and she said, "I came here to stop disappearing." "I know," he said. "I am not disappearing," she said. "I have not disappeared at all. I am entirely here." "I know," he said again. "And I intend," she said, with the precise and quiet certainty that was entirely her own, "to stay." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her fingers, and Clara slept between them, and James slept in the next room. And outside the window, the mountain stood in the last gold of the evening, and the valley below Caldwell Creek was green and wide, and full of the ongoing, ordinary miracle of a life being lived well and freely, and entirely on the terms of the people living it. The pass would close again in November, and open again in April, and close and open, the way it always had and always would, measuring the years in the way of the high country, in seasons rather than calendars. And every spring when it opened and the first mail came through, and the first stage rolled into Caldwell Creek's one proper street, Ira Hartwell would think of a woman climbing down from a coach in the cold November air, and he would look across at whatever Pearl was doing, whatever room or street or paddock she was in, and she would occasionally look back at him in that direct and knowing way of hers, and they would both understand without saying it that the world had. On that particular November afternoon in 1882, arranged itself into something very right. James Hartwell, when he was old enough to understand stories, would ask his mother to tell him the one about how she had arrived in Caldwell Creek, and Pearl would sit with him in the evenings and tell it plainly and honestly, the way she told everything. She would tell him that she had come a long way from a life that had made her small and that she had chosen this place from a map, and that the pass had closed behind her, and the winter had been long and hard and beautiful, and that she had found his father and his father had found her, and that she had not been afraid since, not in the deep-down way she had been before, not in the way that makes a person invisible to themselves. And James would look at her with his mother's gray eyes and say that it sounded like she had been very brave, and Pearl would say that she had been scared and determined, which was usually what brave looked like when it was honest, and she would hold him and she would mean it. And out in the livery behind the house Ira would be working in the lamplight, and Clara would be asleep, and the mountains would be whatever they were that evening, gold or white or violet or dark, always enormous, always there. The walls of the world that had held everything in, until it became exactly what it was meant to be.